Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I want to thank all of you for being here this morning on day two of our professional development. I know it has been a very trying time over these last couple months. I know many of you feel like you haven't even had a summer because last school year ended and this year is beginning, and many of you have worked most of the summer trying to get ready and prepared, but I hope you found some time for yourselves. The topic we're going to be talking about today is trauma-informed practices in care. And a few things before we get started. Thank you all for muting yourselves. Annette is going to post in the chat box a Google Doc where you can put all your questions. So any questions you might have, please type those on the Google Sheet that we've created, and we'll be able to answer those questions at the end of the presentation. We have a lot of information to go over today. Also, attached to that Google Doc is a link to a folder on Mission Control titled Trauma-Informed Practices in Care. And in that folder, you will find all the slides that are going to be presented today, as well as the resources and resource sheets that they are going to share with you. So we wanted to make sure you had a link to those items as well, okay? Just so you know, I will be taking some screenshots towards the end of this presentation of just the participant's name for attendance purposes. So if you hear a little camera clicking, that's just me documenting the attendance. And without further ado, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So today we're going to be talking about trauma and its effects on the brain, and also in this pandemic, kind of what we are all experiencing. We also are going to be talking about tier 1 interventions and classroom routines that you can have in your classroom to support students. And finally, we're going to be looking at the importance of self-care, because we know it's really important that as adults in the classroom that we kind of identify and take care of ourselves so we can serve our students. So those are the three areas and topics we're going to be looking at today. So we're going to begin with trauma and its effects.
Okay, so let's talk about trauma and its effects. So first of all, what is trauma? So the definition of trauma is the exposure to a distressing experience or event that overwhelms a person's ability to respond. Honestly, we could easily spend the whole training on this topic, so I'm gonna try to do a brief crash course and really just highlight some key points for you. When we talk about trauma, we're talking about different types of trauma. Acute trauma results from a single incident. For example, that can be maybe a really bad car accident where there was injuries or loss of life that really impacts someone, right? Or a one-time assault or robbery, that kind of one-time incident. Then we have chronic trauma, which is repeated and prolonged exposure to something such as child abuse, bullying, domestic violence. Then we also have complex trauma, and that's exposure to multiple traumatic events, often very invasive and of a very interpersonal nature. We're also going to be covering community and racial historical trauma. I'm actually going to talk about that in a couple slides, so hold on to that though, but we will be covering that today. But first, let's talk about this Kaiser study. So in the late 90s, Kaiser did this major study on adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACE or ACEs, and people refer to it as the ACE study. So this study looked at childhood abuse, neglect, and household challenges, and it really looked at how those experiences affected the health and well-being of adults in later life. So when we're talking about these adverse childhood experiences, you know, they were asking questions about abuse and neglect, like have they experienced violence or abuse themselves? Had they witnessed violence in the home or in their community? They were also looking at environmental factors such as substance use and abuse, mental health problems, parental separation, family, incarcerations if they have a relative who was in prison. And there were 17,000 participants in this study. And what they found was that, first of all, ACEs were common across populations. 2/3 of participants reported that at least one ACE, that they had experienced one ACE. 1 in 5 reported 3 or more ACEs. And one of the major findings was that as the number of ACEs increase, so does the risk for negative outcomes in later life, long-term outcomes. There were some limitations to this study, for sure, to the initial study, I guess I should say. Most participants were middle class. They were white, middle-aged, and many had some kind of college background, so they were educated, right? But when you think about that and think about our demographics and the students and families that we serve, if those were the numbers with the people in the study, then our numbers are higher. And so actually this study has been adapted ever since. And there's another study that accounts for this called the Urban ACE study, where they've modified the questions to reflect some of these things that do come into play as well. In any case, this was a landmark study that really brought the issue of trauma to the forefront, and it just kind of forced all the different community sectors to look at how trauma affects our everyday, how we work with students and families, and how we can support them. Again, the effects that have come out of the study and that have been seen throughout the years since with other numerous studies have been that there are lasting long-term effects on an individual, and it really impacts them in many aspects of their life. And some of the major things is that it really impacts the ability to regulate emotionally, to develop healthy relationships, and most importantly, I think for us in a school setting, the ability to really engage and to learn, right? So let's talk about COVID-19 and this collective trauma that we're all going through right now. We're in the middle of a pandemic. It's this public health emergency that really has isolated us in a big way. And it's really changed the way we do things and the way we live, right, from what we were used to. We've been isolated from each other, from our work, from school, from our family and friends. It has directly affected some of us, right? Some of us know either people who have been sick, people who have passed away, or maybe, you've been sick yourself, or indirectly, we know maybe the neighbor was sick, or your friend's relative passed away. It's really just has impacted us so much. We've seen famous people on TV, right, come out and share their experiences. So the overall well-being and safety of individuals and communities has really been challenged with this. And there's been a range of emotional reactions, from shock and disbelief to anger, right? I don't want to wear a mask, and this is really inconvenient, and to frustration or sadness, right, due to loss of family, as mentioned, but also loss of our freedom to just go to the restaurant without worrying about it, right? Doing all those things that we were used to doing, to panic. The hoarding of toilet paper and cleaning supplies, that's where that came from. So there's been this range, first of all, of all these emotional reactions. But then we've also had an increase in unhealthy behavior, unfortunately. Substance use and abuse has been on the rise, as has been domestic violence calls. Child maltreatment. Unfortunately, I'm hearing that CPS calls have decreased. But guess what? Guess who calls the most? We do, right? Schools or youth serving organizations, because we're the ones who are mandated reporters and we're the ones who work with kids. But since they haven't been coming to us, they're staying home. So a lot of child abuse is not being reported at the moment. Our levels of poverty and homelessness have gotten worse. Mental health issues have been exacerbated. There's been a lot more family separations as well, not only due to fear of the coronavirus, due to fear of deportation, but also because parents can't take care of their kids and work if the kids weren't going to school. So I know at the end of last year when we were trying to get a hold of some families, that's what we found. Oh yes, we sent my son to his aunt's in Bakersfield because he has internet there, and my sister can help with their homework and take care of them while I'm working. Another one of our students was sent to Mexico to stay with his grandparents, right? So there's been a lot of that happening. And then lastly, there's been a lot of grief and loss that has not been processed properly, unfortunately. Since large gatherings of groups are not allowed, funerals are being done differently or not at all. And so there's no closure. How many stories have you heard of people losing someone and they weren't able to say goodbye? No one's allowed in the hospital with them. And so there's a lot of that just grief that's kind of staying around, but there's nowhere it just hasn't been processed properly, unfortunately. And whether due to COVID or not, it could be COVID-related death or non-related COVID deaths, because again, since we can't do funerals the normal way, there's no gatherings of groups, so people are missing on that like family time to really grieve properly. Okay, so it would be very remiss of me if I didn't spend a little time to talk about racial and historical trauma. Aside from the coronavirus, in the last few months, we've all been experiencing together as a community, as a society, the social unrest that has unfolded due to historical and racial trauma. So racial trauma refers to the stressful impact or emotional pain of one's experience with racism and discrimination. This is talking about, refers to like racial slurs and threats made by anyone, police harassment and brutality. Unfortunately, we've had a lot of examples of that on TV, on social media. Just the chronic examples of discrimination and racism that keep happening, of microaggressions, right? How many times will people call the police on someone simply because of the color of their skin, right? Those kinds of things that just happen. When we're talking about historical trauma, this is trauma that impacts entire communities, and it's passed on generation to generation. So that's, where we have, for example, the Native American community. That's probably the first major example. Due to their history of what happened to the Native American community and the violent colonization, right? It has manifested into high rates of suicide, of domestic violence. There's high rates of alcoholism and child abuse, and really just poverty. If you ever go into a reservation and actually where the people live. I'm not talking about like the casinos or anything, but you know that the Native American communities and in, especially in other states too, there's some high rates of just poverty and again of all these alcoholism and domestic violence issues that happen. We can also talk about, you know, the Jewish community or other communities that have had a history of genocide. Um, you know, that's again passed on generation to generation. And then, you know, our African American community with slavery, first of all, and and again going back to generations of discrimination and racism, segregation and poverty. All that stuff leads to stress, to high rates of substance abuse, of mental health issues, of domestic violence, of just um, poverty, just in general negative experiences. And all this was catapulted by the Black Lives Movement, but it's not new and it's not something that just happened. It's been around, and that's as a result, it's what we're seeing now. But and all that racial and historical trauma that has happened, then really also comes back to us here in our community in different ways. So we do have some community violence that have happened here in our own neighborhoods. I remember last year at the beginning of the year, right at the beginning of, before we started school, there was that shooting near Wainimi Elementary that happened that, you know, was big trauma for that neighborhood. How many times have we heard of drive-bys happening, or stabbings or shootings? Deportation is another one that really affects our students and our families. And it's separating families and the fear. How many times have I talked to students who come crying to me because they're afraid that someone's gonna come take their mom or their dad? And even if it's not every family in our community, but if there were to be a raid, you know, people are going to see ICE come in and take families away or people away. That's major. That's scary. And then the other big one for us, and that's happening right now all over the state, is natural disasters, right? Specifically fires. We knock on wood, right now we're okay. We don't have one right here, but that wasn't the case 2 years ago when that one affected all of us, again, whether directly or indirectly. Some people's homes were directly impacted by it, and others, you know, we all saw the hillside burning, and that's something that we're not going to forget. And the smoke and the school closures. So we've had a lot of different community traumas that also affect us, and that really, that we need to keep in mind that we all experience them differently, but as adults as well as kids, and maybe some of those, I know that we were safe, for example, here at school when the fires were happening, but the kids, all they see or remember is that the day before they could see flames right on the hillside, and they've seen it on TV or on social media. So they were scared. They were like, you know, is the fire gonna come to us? I remember a kid telling me that every time he closed his eyes, he would see flames. And so, you know, we gotta be mindful of that and keep that in mind when we're working with our students, of all these different types of traumas that could be impacting them and how they're thinking about things, how they see the world. So some of the signs of traumas that we can look at or look for, I guess I should say. Here's a table. I'm not going to read every single one, but I noticed that there's some that are the same across the board. They just look different. For example, talking about trauma incidents, or talking about these scary feelings over and over, you know, continuing to talk about it. And then for the younger ones, 0 to 5, even just repeating them through play, right? So I thought that was interesting. Fighting and wanting to be left alone or not wanting to spend time with friends, you know, starting to withdraw a little more. Getting in trouble, making some of those poor choices that to get negative attention, some kind of attention, and difficulty paying attention, being tired all the time or not feeling well. Think of the kids that we have who have a headache or a stomach ache all the time. There's something else going on, and we always know that. We got to figure out what is going on, though. So again, I'm not going to read all of them, but this is something for you to look at and to have as a resource. So let's talk a little bit about, well, why is this so important when it comes to learning? We're going to watch this brief video from Dr. Jacob Ham. This is another topic, and I know I keep saying this, but we honestly could also do a full training on just the learning and the brain alone. That's really fascinating. And so if you're interested in more of that, I recommend you check out Dr. Jacob Ham. I linked his website here, and then, or you can Google him. He has a YouTube channel. He has a lot of really cool videos, but we're gonna watch this one right now.
Hey, welcome back. Today, I really wanted to think about what's the best way to teach teachers about trauma without getting them distracted with all the technical stuff, and what's the most important thing for them to understand and learn. And I thought that the best way to do it might be to just make a difference between a learning brain versus a brain in survival mode. So we'll just call it learning brain versus survival brain. This is the difference. So learning brain is this brain that's open to learning new information, and it's completely okay with ambiguity and grays and vagueness, and it sees the big picture. It like pulls back and is on the balcony, can look over the forest and figure out what's going on. On an emotional level, people in learning brain feel calm, peaceful, maybe a little excited about what they're about to learn, maybe a little playful and having fun too, and definitely curious. And they're not afraid of making mistakes because it's just part of the learning process. And so they're not really thinking about themselves. And they actually feel a little bit of confidence that if they just apply themselves, they might pick up what they're trying to learn. Now, survival brain, on the other hand, is completely different. It's hyper-focused on threat. It doesn't like ambiguity. It wants clear, hard facts. It thinks in black and white terms. It doesn't want anything to be gray at all. Emotionally, you can imagine that survival brain makes people feel panicky, feel like a little obsessive and afraid of getting things wrong. And they don't feel calm and open to learning new things. They just want to get things over with. And people in survival brain also really don't like making mistakes, and they are afraid of looking stupid too. So students in survival brain don't want to be picked on. They don't want to raise their hand and ask questions and look stupid. And so these people are also filled with doubt about their own ability to learn stuff, and they're afraid that other people can see how stupid they really are. It's really important to understand how learning brain and survival brain interact, because survival brain always trumps learning brain. And it makes sense, because survival brain is just trying to save your life. And so if it thinks that there's something dangerous happening, you better pay attention to it, right? But the tricky thing is that as survival brain stays on longer and longer, it's hard to get out of that. And it's really go into learning brain. And the way I think about it is kind of like the myth of Sisyphus. You know, that guy who has to push a rock up a hill, and then every day it falls back down and he has to do it over and over again. Well, being in learning brain is like being up on the high parts of that mountain. You can see the expanse of what's going on, but it also takes a lot of work to be up there. And at any second, if you're not paying attention and putting effort into it, it's so easy to slip back into survival brain again. And that rock that Sisyphus is trying to push up, well, that's kind of like stress. And the more stressed you feel, the heavier and bigger that rock gets, and it just pushes you back into survival brain quicker. The kicker is that for traumatized people, stress is a really rigid and intense thing. And so with trauma, any little stress makes that rock grow way bigger than it normally would. And because people with trauma misperceive ambiguous situations as threatening and stressful, that rock just stays big all the time. Now, the good news is that the more you control stress, well, the easier it is to be in learning brain, right? Because that rock is a lot smaller. And what I really want to highlight for teachers is that the best way to keep students in learning brain goes back to why I spent so much time talking about attachment. Students best learn when they feel like they're safe and supported by the adults around them. So it's kind of like a baby elephant. You know how like on those nature shows, the baby elephant is like playing with leaves or exploring a tree or something like that and having a lot of fun. And the only reason why they can do that is because there's a whole group of mama elephants around that baby protecting it and looking out for danger. So a kid with trauma or who's stuck in survival brain, it's kind of like that baby elephant who doesn't have protective adults around them. They can't play and learn because they're way too focused looking out for threat and danger. So this is why I really believe that the most important thing that schools need to focus on, way more important than any kind of techniques or curricula, is really whether or not they are creating that environment where students feel like they're surrounded by these big mama elephants who are going to protect them and watch out for them and make them safe. And when students have that, I bet you it unlocks their curiosity, their eagerness to learn, and play as a way to learn. So I hope that's helpful. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Thanks.
Okay, so as we heard from Dr. Ham, when there's trauma occurring, the learning brain shuts down, right? And the learning brain is the prefrontal cortex right here. So that's the thinking part of our brain. That's what helps us make rational decisions. And unfortunately, that's the last part of the brain that develops, right? Research shows that up until like early to mid 20s, your prefrontal cortex finally fully develops. That explains why teenagers are more prone to engage in risky behavior and to make poor choices, right? Drugs and alcohol and that kind of thing. And for the younger kids and for all of them, we're kind of that part of the brain for them. That's why we teach them all these skills. So, but when there's danger or the brain senses danger, then that's when the amygdala steps in. And the amygdala is like the guard dog. That's the one that asks, okay, am I safe? And then it jumps into action. The amygdala is a doer. That's the survival brain, right? The fight or flight gets activated. Fight is when we're talking about like anger or rage or you're frustrated and that's what's coming out, or your flight is that panic or fear or worry. Sometimes we have freeze though, right? Maybe you just shut down, you feel helpless and numb. So those are the different reactions that the amygdala is going to go to. And what happens with trauma is that over time and with repeated exposure, it actually changes your brain. Brain structures, your neurochemistry, as well as genetic expression is changed. And that impacts learning and behavior. Some of the ways that it impacts learning is organizing narrative material, or again, regulating emotions or executive functioning. Some of the impacts it has on behavior include impulsivity and reactivity. That's where you see like the defiance and aggression, or even withdrawal, right, or perfectionism. So it's really, it really does change the brain, and it impacts how we respond to things, and that's what we're seeing with the students. So some examples of these fight or flight or freeze behaviors that you might see in the classroom are listed here. I kind of debated whether I would include this slide or not, because right now we're not in the classroom physically, we're doing distance learning. But then I thought, at one point we ideally, right, we're gonna be going back into the classroom, but also some of these you will be seeing them regardless of whether we're in physical, same physical space or not. For example, under fight, you're yelling or cursing or hurting others. Depending on what is going on in the home, you might see some of that with your student, and their family members or siblings, right? Some of the flight responses that I could see happening that I know happened in the spring were like refusing to participate, or showing up to your Zoom with the hoodie or covering their face, that kind of thing. Some of the freeze responses, problems focusing or remembering things, or just tuning out when you're trying to teach them something via Zoom, or sleepiness. And granted, a lot of these, you also, again, you take it with, okay, what's going on in the home, talking to the student. Sleepiness can be like they stay up late watching TV or playing video games, right? Or is it that they have a normal sleep routine, but they're still just really tired all the time? Then that's something different. So those, these are some examples, but again, you take them and think about like, well, what else is going in the home, in the home that could be affecting the student.
So that was a lot of information, and a lot of heavy information, I think. So I just want you to take a moment to pause and reflect a little bit for yourself, what stood out, what resonated, and just think about it for yourself. And one thing I do want to leave you with is that I know it can be disheartening to learn about the trauma and how that changes the brain, but also know that healing also changes the brain. And that's where the relationships and all the supportive strategies come in that really make a difference. And so now I'm going to pass it on to Lucero.
So this is our third time presenting, and I still don't get tired of the baby elephant part. And as we are reflecting upon what we just heard and thinking about trauma, there are times when we think about how this relates to our work with those students, and also how it relates to our personal experience. So we have a question for you that we want you to think about. And our question is, we're missing the question, Dave. What is the thing that you remember the most about school? So, which of the following characterizes what came to mind? A, academic content. B, a relationship or social aspect of school. C, how school made you feel. And D, other. So we'll take about a minute to wait for people to respond to this. Think about when you were little, when you were in school. What is something that comes to mind to you when you're thinking about your favorite things?
We were almost there, Lucero. Almost.
Right. Okay, so we have that the majority of people answer that what comes to mind is a relationship or social aspect of school. In second place, how school made you feel. And let me tell you that this is exactly what we've seen in the other presentations. More people think about how school made them feel or the relationships they had. And this is going to transition us into our next part of the presentation. I'm going to be talking about strategies in the classroom. And I want to mention that when we talk about the strategies, these are just ideas. And when we talk about taking the time to build community, we're not saying that academic content should not be a priority, because that's always a priority, but we want to talk to you about how to complement that with trying to build community with your students.
So now that you've heard about trauma, how it affects the brain, the different types, and how it can affect learning, let's talk about trauma-informed practices. So trauma-informed practices, such as creating a safe and supportive environment and helping students develop consistent, positive relationships with peers and adults are powerful ways to mitigate the effects of trauma and to promote resilience in children and youth. So these practices are going to help you create a safe environment. But it is very important to remember that this is not just for a certain number of students. When you work on this, you're creating a safe environment for all students. I want to take a few seconds to acknowledge that we understand that this is a lot. And I know that during this time, the school year is going to look different. Distance learning is different, it's challenging. And it is a lot to sometimes be asked to be part of professional development, especially when we're about to start. And I know that right now people are having a lot of information and having to learn different things, different apps, and it's overwhelming. But I want to take the time to mention that trauma-informed practices or an approach, it is not a program. And I like how it explains it in this slide, and it talks about, again, keeping in mind that this is not a program or about those kids. Creating trauma-informed or sensitive schools embraces empathy at its roadmap, acknowledges individuals as each having unique experiences, and those experiences, if properly cultivated, can strengthen the village. So this is not a program, this is not something additional that is going to create more work. This is something that you're probably already doing with your students. This is just more of a reminder to be mindful and to work together to embrace those challenges that distance learning is going to create. So one of the roles in the classroom is to engage students. And I'm going to be talking about strategies for trauma-informed practices. And those strategies fall into 3 categories. The first one is to regulate, relate, and to reason. So let's talk about the first set of strategies to help with regulation. So this is when students are feeling physically and emotionally calm and settled. Supporting students become regulated should be our first priority. Again, this is a time when students have been exposed to a lot of stress. There might be an increase in anxiety. And I'm not even just talking about students that have experienced trauma. I'm talking about any one of our students just because of what's been happening during the past few months. So we want to be able to model and provide opportunities for students to learn to regulate. So first, we can start by teaching them and helping them practice grounding and centering exercises. And this is when we focus on what's happening in our mind, our body, and our surroundings. So when we talk about grounding, is we want to be able to come back to the present. As you know, sometimes our minds are everywhere. We're not living in the moment. When we're talking about students and when they are joining us during the synchronous time, during a virtual meeting, we want to be able to provide opportunities for them to practice this. It is also very important to provide for them structure and consistency. And this would look like being able to establish a routine for them so they know what to expect when they meet with us. Some examples are when we create a calendar for class so they know what's coming, when we have an agenda for our meeting, when we create a schedule for them. If you think about this, for some of the students, school has always been that place where they can find structure and consistency. We have students that are part of the foster care system. We have students that are homeless or that have difficult home situations. So coming to school and having a routine helps them feel safe and secure. We are not able to provide that at this moment, but we can work on providing the structure and consistency in the time that we do spend together, even if it's virtually. Another way that we can help support our students is to provide breaks and encourage physical activity. I know that there is a certain amount of minutes that we have to do synchronous time, and we need to be very mindful of that, of how long they can stay connected with us. I know, I speak for myself, that it is difficult for me to be part of the Zoom meetings for an hour. Now I can only imagine what it's like for the kid. So to think about this and to provide breaks, to encourage physical activity when they're not meeting with us, and just to be mindful, because all of this helps them self-regulate. Then we can talk about self-awareness, and we want to be able to provide opportunities for them to communicate their feelings. And we can do that by being creative and incorporating this into any of the assignments that you might assign to them. So you might want to use Flipgrid, and you might want to use this type of opportunity for them to express how they feel, also to build community. And when we talk about self-regulation, I'm referring to those activities that are going to help them learn how to relax and how to calm themselves. And for example, this is when we want to use and teach them about mindfulness, about breathing exercises. Another example is to listen to music when we're working together. Again, when we're looking at all of these strategies, the goal is to help our students go from a survival brain to a learning brain. If we help them learn how to regulate and we get to the learning brain, that's when we're going to be able to do our job and teach them. So now we move on to the next set of strategies that are going to help us be able to relate to the students. And this is when kids are feeling socially and emotionally connected through safe and supportive relationships. For many students, the school is the place that creates a sense of safety and support. And distance learning is going to represent a loss for them, especially if they're navigating adversity at home. So we want to be able to build community and focus on building relationships. And you might ask, how do you build community and relationships without being able to interact in person or in the classroom? But as much as this is going to be a challenge, this should also be a priority. So we want to allow relationships and well-being to take priority right now. I know that ideally, in a perfect world, we would meet with our students, we would set a routine, they would pay attention, and we would be able to teach them academic content right away. But in reality, this is going to be different because the students that are coming into the classroom have not met you before. So now we don't have that time, those 6.5 hours during the day when they would interact with you and you would get to know them. Now it's going to be during a virtual setting and you're not going to have as much time. So thinking about those challenges can also create a learning experience and different opportunities. So in this sense, we are going to have to be very creative. We also want to remember that it's important to show appreciation for students' efforts. I know we create expectations, and when sometimes they don't meet those expectations, it can be frustrating. But also we want to celebrate those times when they make an improvement or we know that they're trying. If they haven't joined our meeting for the past 3 days, then all of a sudden show up, instead of telling them in front of the class, where have you been? Maybe having those conversations in private and with the other students to celebrate that they're there and they're finally participating. We want to model positive interaction with them. We want to promote a positive and healthy environment. We want to give them opportunities to build positive relationships with their classmates as well. And to take into consideration the importance of social emotional learning practices and learning activities. So when we build community, those are the times when we get to know their students and they get to know each other as well. I know this is going to be challenging during distance learning, but like I mentioned before, it's going to also be a learning experience. If you think about this, if you build those connections with the kids, there are times when we struggle with them not participating, not wanting to log in. Think about the time when you were in school and you wanted to be in class because you liked your teacher, because you enjoyed being with your classmates. If we build those connections, they are going to be more likely to join our Zoom meetings. They're going to be more likely to complete their assignments just because they feel a connection with their teacher and with their classmates. And this is going to encourage more engagement and participation. And for the last strategy, I would like to encourage you to connect with families. As a counselor, I understand how challenging it might be to get a hold of parents or families, but this should also be one of our priorities when we're trying to build community and build relationships, because that connection really goes a long way. So we move on to our next set of strategies. And once students feel regulated and related, that's when we can support their learning of academic content. I would like to remind you to be realistic and gentle about creating a new normal with students and their families. We understand that, and I've mentioned this so many times, distance learning is going to be different and the school year is going to feel different. One of the strategies you can use is to reduce workload for yourself and for your students. So effective and meaningful lessons and activities may not happen immediately all at once. And it's important to give yourself permission and your students permission for trial and error. I want to say, be patient, prioritize, and sometimes we need to learn to let some things go. We want to support executive functioning on self-management skills and breaking work into smaller pieces. And in addition, provide information in digestible amount. Let's say that normally you would assign 5-word problems for homework. You might want to consider assigning only 2 or 3. Again, you're going to be learning as you go. And encourage students to lead the way in sharing what they do and do not understand about their current situation. So we want to encourage them to ask questions, to ask for help, because this is a skill that is going to help them in school and in life. Now we've talked about different strategies. Why are trauma-informed practices important? Well, learning takes place in the context of relationship and a sense of safety and connectedness. And again, we're not just encouraging these practices so you can help the kids that have experienced trauma or adversity, because most of the time we don't know who those kids are. But all of the practices that we've mentioned, they benefit all the students in your classroom. And we are also realistic and understand that distance learning creates barriers to students' access to safe environments, healthy relationships, and needed support. And as much as this is going to be a challenge, using trauma-informed practices should also be a priority. So let's talk about some ideas about trauma-informed practices and distance learning. Now, here are some ideas that you can use during distance learning with your class. We've talked about establishing a routine, and one strategy is to use morning meetings. I'm going to show you a Google slide that a teacher created that she uses every morning with her students. So this is an example of what a morning meeting might look like during distance learning. As you can see, this teacher divided the slide into different sections. So they have a morning greeting, and with different ways that the student can greet their classmates. A quote of the day, a section where you can include a video about growth mindset, or perhaps you can do mindfulness. I like the idea of having a quote of the day with a question that's not academic, but it's meant to help you get to know the students. And my favorite part about this morning meeting is a section where they can share with their classmates, or you can perhaps divide it into smaller groups or pair them so they can talk to each other. Another idea of an activity that you can use to build community is something that I saw on TikTok. And let me tell you that one of the highlights of this summer was me finding the educational aspect of TikTok, what they call teacher TikTok. So this is what I saw. So this is called a put a finger down challenge. And what you do is you have the students hold all 10 fingers up and you ask them to put a finger down if a statement is true for them. They should not talk and they need to be paying attention to what others are doing so they can learn about them. And you have different statements for them. In this one, they say, put a finger down if you're happy school is starting. Put a finger down if you're stoked to be starting the year with distance learning. And again, you can change the statement, you can make it your own. The whole idea is for everyone to participate and to get to know each other as well. And, you know, they ask different things about shows, about what they did. And I thought this one was really funny. Put a finger down if you still have enough toilet paper. The next idea is to provide opportunities to practice SEL skills. And this is where I'm going to sound like a commercial, because I really encourage teachers to use Second Step and to take advantage of the resources we have at our schools. So I know a lot of you already have this and probably started last year. This is something that is a resource for teachers. And when you're thinking about how can I incorporate SEL, you don't need to do any additional work. The way that Second Step works is you have the lessons, they're scripted, you have the videos, you have everything you need. And it's important to just spend the time and, you know, try to figure out how we're going to do this during distance learning. But Second Step is such a great program. The last idea is to be the calm. And I know that can be challenging. And this is going to transition into our next part of the presentation, where Michelle is going to be talking about self-care, giving you ideas and emphasizing how this should be your priority number one.
So I'm going to lead the discussion on self-care, and in this section, I'm going to walk you through a general understanding of what secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma is, also discussing the symptoms of compassion fatigue and burnout, then leading us into a discussion of the importance of self-care and encouraging you all to create a self-care plan. And then I'm going to tie it together with the concept of co-regulation and modeling coping skills for our students. And then I'm going to walk you through a few resources that will be available to you in a file that will be on the drive. So let's talk about vicarious trauma and burnout. So vicarious trauma or secondary trauma is when we have these empathic responses to students. And when we hear about their trauma, it often leads to internalized feelings of the trauma when we actually haven't experienced it. And then what happens is that if we have a lot of this happening in our workplace, we can develop what's called compassion fatigue, which is the result of the constant demands to care for others, which might cause us emotional stress or apathy. And the dangers of this is that high levels of compassion fatigue in our workplace can often lead to burnout, which is just physical and emotional exhaustion. This could lead to negative self-concept, a general loss of concern and feeling for your students, your parents, or your colleagues. And it's very difficult to overcome these feelings when you're constantly put in situations where your stress response is being elevated. As educators, we are at risk for developing secondary trauma or compassion fatigue, and it's important that we are aware of this so that we can create strategies to help prevent that. So these are some warning signs of vicarious trauma that you should be aware of. Hypervigilance basically just means you're constantly on the lookout for potential threats, like you're on high alert. You can also experience poor boundaries, which is really lacking balance or feeling powerless and hopeless. You might be taking on too much, and you might be consequently feeling depleted. Avoidance is also another sign, and this is where we just shut down and disconnect. Sometimes we feel numb or detached. Sometimes we just feel like we want to emotionally withdraw from others. And then the inability to empathize. So this might be where we might just feel emotionally disconnected or just numb to the stories or the backgrounds or the histories of the trauma that our students might be bringing with them to school. And then we run the risk of developing poor addictions that might not be very productive. We might increase our alcohol consumption, engage in more risky behaviors, such as gambling or drug use. And then physical ailments, chronic exhaustions, those are self-explanatory. These are the somatic symptoms that we feel physically or the emotional symptoms that we feel mentally. And minimizing typically happens when it's a defense mechanism, when we try to minimize what we're hearing because it's triggering probably some unresolved trauma within ourselves. So as a defense mechanism, we tend to minimize what we're hearing as a protection so that we do not get ourselves triggered by what we are exposed to with our students. Sometimes you might experience anger or cynicism. So when you are angry at being exposed to traumatic events, this might be a maladaptive coping skill because you're not able to manage the feelings that you have or understand the feelings that you have. So anger is the place that you go. And then feelings of professional inadequacy. This happens when we just feel like we aren't stepping up to the plate. We are insecure about our job performance. You might second guess yourself when you're feeling the effects of vicarious trauma. So these are the main warning signs. And I'm going to take it a step further and just help you understand that there is both a personal impact of vicarious trauma as well as a professional impact of vicarious trauma. So similar to the warning signs that I just explained to you, personally, things to be on the lookout for is, how is your physical health? Are you experiencing any type of impact physically, such as sleep problems or changes in your appetite, or you're getting sick more often, or you're just feeling low energy, fatigue? Or how about your emotional health? Are you more anxious? Do you feel more irritable? Have you lost a sense of your empathy? Do you feel like you're emotionally shutting down and you feel hopeless? And behaviorally, are you noticing that you're more impatient with others, or that your mood is more irritable? Or maybe you're just more forgetful or absent-minded, or maybe because of that hypervigilance, you have an elevated startle response. You're constantly anxious and concerned about potential threats around you. And the cognitive impact. Are you losing the ability to concentrate? Are you becoming less flexible and more rigid in how you make decisions and how you go about your daily tasks? Do you feel the sense of having to be perfect in everything you do, and because of that, you're incapable of getting through the task? And there's also an interpersonal or relational impact where you might start isolating or feeling lonely or withdrawing, or you might have lost a sense of trust in people that you once felt were trustworthy. And in the last area is more that spiritual kind of impact, where we might feel a sense of overall unfairness of what's going on in the world around us. You might start questioning your own personal beliefs or spiritual beliefs, or it might be more existential, where you feel like there's a loss of purpose. Professionally, these tie together, and you might start seeing an impact on your job tasks. Again, there might be a decrease in your quality and quantity of work. You might be less motivated to do things the way that you know should be done for our students, and just not be motivated to do that. Morale-wise, you might just have a loss of interest or just a general attitude of apathy. There might be feelings of demoralization or just feeling incompetent. Again, in the job place, there might be interpersonal ramifications where you might find yourself withdrawing from colleagues that you once sought support from. You might notice that your communication skills are less effective and that you might be experiencing more conflicts with staff and others in the workplace. And behaviorally, you might notice a higher increase in absenteeism. Maybe you're calling sick more often than you used to as a way of avoiding the occupational stress because of vicarious trauma. Maybe you're overworking as a defense mechanism to keep yourself from experiencing some of these feelings, though overworking is a good distraction. Maybe you have poor judgment in student behavior or with parent interaction or with staff interaction, and your judgment kind of impairs your job performance. So it's important to keep these in mind, because we need to be able to have awareness of it so that we can prevent these things from occurring in our personal and professional lives. One thing I want to talk about is another sign of compassion fatigue, which is called the silencing response. And again, this is a defense mechanism, and you might not be aware that you're doing it. And the silencing response is just a response where we, as the caretaker, find ways to silence those who are manifesting trauma symptoms. So this is separate from setting boundaries or redirecting inappropriate behavior. This is a response where we are shutting down our empathic responses and inadvertently demanding that the trauma survivor keep their problems to themselves. And this happens because oftentimes, whatever the trauma might be that the student or the person is bringing to the forefront could be triggering trauma responses from the caretaker's past, and that's too difficult for them to process and manage, so silencing is their coping mechanism to avoid it. When we engage in the silencing response, oftentimes the thoughts that occur are, you just wish the student would just get over it. Or maybe you don't believe what they're telling you. Or maybe you're noticing more anger when they manifest their trauma symptoms. Or on the opposite side of anger, maybe your tactic is to use humor to minimize the student when they start talking about their problems. These things happen because we typically feel incompetent or incapable of helping, so minimizing and silencing protects us from those feelings. And this is dangerous because if we do this silencing type of response, we might be choosing to ignore the symptoms of trauma in our student altogether and not connecting them with sources of support that could help them through it. And why do I talk about all this? Because at the end of the day, we have a duty of care. We care for our students during the school day. And in order for us to provide the maximum care possible, we have to make sure that we have our needs met. So understanding these signs of vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout leads you to acknowledging how this affects you personally and professionally. Helps you understand that you don't have to do this by yourself. Seek support from others so that you can be your best self. And then recognizing that in order to be your best self, you have an ethical duty for yourself to engage in regular self-care. So let's talk a little bit about self-care. Self-care is just a collection of strategies that we use to prevent or alleviate the symptoms of vicarious trauma. In order for these strategies to be effective, you have to make a conscious effort to practice these things on a regular basis. And if you get to the point where you practice these strategies on a regular basis, you find a sense of balance, both personally and professionally, that help to prevent any negative consequences of compassion fatigue and burnout. So like I say, if we want to be helpful to others, we have to start with our own prevention and our own self-care. So when we're talking about components of self-care, 4 areas that you want to think about. You want to think about your physical self-care. You want to think about your psychological self-care, which is more cognitive, your emotional self-care or your mental health, and your workplace self-care. And with those 4 areas, you want to eventually develop a self-care plan that you can readily implement on a regular basis. And some basic things to consider in your self-care plan are some physical strategies, such as sleep and eating and exercise, psychological, setting boundaries and finding a sense of balance, and also emotionally, kind of having that positive attitude, that glass half full versus glass half empty mentality. These are all adaptive strategies to prevent compassion fatigue and burnout from occurring. So looking into the key areas of self-care, like I said, think Maslow, and on Maslow's hierarchy, the first row is basically your physical needs. So physical fitness, nutrition and hydration, sleep and rest. If you think about our jobs, we have pretty stressful jobs. And there are some ailments that happen when we are more stressed out, which is usually muscle tension, particularly in the jaw, the neck, and the back. And so research shows that by exercising, we can reduce these physical ailments so that we feel better. So a tip would be, make it a point to exercise or move your body a minimum of 30 minutes a day. With nutrition and hydration, let's face it, we often make poor choices food-wise when we are stressed out. Maybe you don't take a lunch, or maybe you go to the nearest fast food restaurant to get your lunch for the day. And when we make poor food choices, that has a physical response to our bodies, and it makes us feel more fatigued, and we don't feel well. So a tip would be, make it a point to pack yourself a lunch or make yourself meals that are nutritionally balanced, and also drink plenty of water throughout the day. And then sleep and rest. How many of you actually get 8 hours of sleep? Most adults require 7 to 8 hours, but most adults probably get 5 to 6. And when we're stressed out, we might have more sleep disturbances, and our sleep cycle is disrupted. And when that happens, we're just not at our best physically, mentally, or psychologically. So you want to make sure that you're getting adequate sleep, and I highly encourage you to try to get 8 hours every night if possible. Then we talk about assertiveness skills, and centering and solitude. So assertiveness skills basically just means that we ask for what we need and express our feelings in respectful and non-violent ways. So when we're able to be assertive in a positive way in our work environment or our personal environment, we're able to set boundaries, we're aware of our limits, and we can request assistance when we need it. Centering and solitude is more of our mindfulness practices. What do you do to reset, to clear your head after stressful days or consecutive stressful days? Some people do crossword puzzles. Some people meditate. Some people keep a journal. But the tip would be to make sure that you incorporate some of these practices in your daily lives so that you can either meditate, have positive affirmations, or engage in positive self-talk or mindfulness. Creating activities or creative activities and fun and enjoyment, these are important just for general life satisfaction. When you're creative, if you have any creative talents like drawing, painting, ceramics, writing, music, whatever that might be, this creative process serves as a focal point for relaxation. So it's important to find your creative outlets and incorporate those into your day. Same with fun and enjoyment. What do you do in your downtime? What do you do that sparks joy in your life? So sometimes when you're stressed out, you may feel like you don't have time or the energy to engage in anything fun and joyful. And so if you're feeling that way, you want to incorporate some more activities that you used to find entertaining and do those more regularly. And then the last three, support provided, support received, set and monitor goals. Support provided simply means, what do you give? How do you support others? Primarily your colleagues at work. So when you are somebody that's dependable or somebody that can be a positive source in somebody else's life, that in itself gives you satisfaction. And so it's important to encourage others and support others in your workplace, but it's also equally important to be able to receive support from others. So what do you get from other people? Something I would suggest is that you identify 2 or 3 of the most nurturing people in your professional life or in your personal life, and figure out how you're going to communicate your needs to them so that they can be a support system for you. And then lastly, setting and monitoring goals. This basically is your self-care plan. You honestly have to schedule self-care. So I'm going to lead you into how to create a self-care plan, but I encourage you to set times of the day that you can actually engage in some of these strategies consistently. Excuse me. So when you're taking care of yourself, these are your protective factors. This is the overall takeaway. So you want to make sure, again, an overview, understand how trauma affects you and affects your students. And when you're aware of how it's affecting you, how is it affecting you in the workplace? Are you experiencing or recognizing signs of burnout or compassion fatigue where you're feeling depleted? Do you have supportive connections at work or at home to help you with debriefing and sharing your struggles so that you can engage in protective strategies to help get you out of that negative outlook with what's going on? Do you have a transitional ritual? Do you leave work at work when you go home? If you don't, then I'm going to encourage you to think about a ritual so that you're not taking the traumas and the feelings and the stresses of work home with you, because that's going to have a long-term effect in your mental health. Think about something good that happened every day. When we think about positive things in our life, they tend to outweigh the negative. Again, build those lifestyle routines that replenish you, which is your self-care plan. And always remember that it's okay to not be okay. You might be experiencing such significant symptoms of vicarious trauma that you might not know who to confide in or how to get help. And if you don't have a supportive system, family-wise, friend-wise, work-wise, we can always fall back on to our EAP program. And I know that the district has that information for you, where you can get some mental health support because of what you're experiencing. But again, bottom line is take care of yourself. And why is this important? This is important because there's this concept of co-regulation. And co-regulation basically means that we are modeling regulatory skills for our students. So these quotes say, only a regulated adult can help a dysregulated child. And that's very true. And another thing to think about is that stressed brains can't teach, and stressed brains can't learn. So when you are demonstrating co-regulation, you are walking through hand in hand with the student, and you're modeling coping skills that are adaptive when you're stressed out or you're feeling negative or fatigued or burnt out. So let's talk a little bit about some of the ways that we can assess these. So when you look at the resource files, I included what's called a professional quality of life scale. And I encourage you to take a look at this and actually take it. And it's a series of questions, 30. And then at the end, it has a scoring system so that you can find out what your scores are. And so basically what this tool does is you think about yourself in the last 30 days and how you've been feeling, and you rate yourself with the rating system right here. When you go to score it, it's going to give you a compassion satisfaction score. And then it's going to give you a burnout score and a secondary traumatic stress score. That compassion satisfaction score is basically a measure of the pleasure that you derive from being able to do your work well. The burnout score is going to give you a score that indicates whether you are at the cusp of experiencing burnout, maybe you're not experiencing burnout, or maybe that you're in burnout and it's giving you some suggestions on how to replenish and engage in self-care. And then the last area is that secondary traumatic stress. And so this is just a good indicator of scores that might indicate that you're having a problem or that you are at risk for secondary traumatic stress. And this is important to know because secondary traumatic stress, compassion fatigue, may lead to burnout. So if you're not aware of it, this is a good tool to use so that you can put some preventative measures in place. The next handout that you're going to see in the drive is an assessment of self-care practice. And this is a good tool to use because it gives you ideas about how to practice self-care across areas of your life. And so the 4 key areas, like I talked about, are your physical self-care, your psychological self-care, your emotional self-care, and your workplace self-care. And this is just a good visual. Again, it has a rating system, and you can see for yourself the areas where maybe you are not utilizing or engaging in self-care activities for those specific areas. And that gives you a good idea to make a plan on how you can increase some of those strategies in any of the 4 areas. I've also included a self-care wheel. And this is just a good visual that gives you ideas for psychological, emotional, spiritual, personal, professional, and physical areas, and some strategies of self-care that might be of interest to you when you are creating your self-care plan. And then I've also included a template for a self-care plan. That's a very nice visual, easy to follow like a flow chart, and it covers each of the areas of the components of self-care. And I highly encourage you to take the time to utilize these handouts and create a plan for yourself so that we can be the most effective educators for our students, especially now with everything that we've been going through in the last 5 months with the social injustices, the pandemic, the economic factors that our families might experiencing, the lack of social connections. Self-care is at the utmost importance right now for ourselves as well as for our students.
Okay, so we have some time to do a breakout session. And so we're going to put you up in little groups of about 4 people. And when you get into your breakout group, I want you to think about the following. Think about a self-care strategy that maybe you've put on the back burner and haven't really been using. And can you start that back up again today? And then I want you to think about a new form of self-care based on the key areas that I introduced in the presentation that you can possibly start today. And then I want you to talk amongst yourselves about how you're going to hold yourself accountable to make sure that you practice these self-care strategies.
Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and create the breakout rooms. We'll be back in about 5 minutes. So remember those prompts, and here we go. What would you like me to type in the message, Michelle? What
I think she
question?
went to a room.
Pardon me?
I think she went into a breakout room.
Okay, Lucero, what is it? What is the first question?
Wait, let me check. I don't have it. It's one existing form of self-care you can start today.
What? Today. Okay. And what's another one?
Identify how you will hold yourself accountable.
Okay. Jasmine, are you there?
Yes, sorry.
Okay. I need to put you in a breakout room, but I'm not quite sure how
No,
to.
I accidentally exited out when we went to it.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Okay. Vince, did you get this message? There you go. Okay, Jasmine, I'm not sure how to do.
I think she can click on the bottom where it says breakout rooms on her screen, and it'll let her go back to her previous room.
Is there a?
You see breakout rooms at the bottom of yours?
I do not.
Unassigned. Here we go. Assigned to. I'm going to throw you in a room. There you go.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, that's good to know. Okay, we have about 5 minutes left total. Should I give them 1 more minute?
Yeah.
Okay, and then bring us back. I just sent her in and now I got to send her out, right? And scene. Okay, it's going to close in 60 seconds. Then they'll be back. Michelle? Oh, she's in the room, right?
Yep.
Okay, let me do my screen share again. Hello, Mr. Angel, I see you. Okay, is everyone back?
Not yet.
Okay.
I think I came back really fast.
Okay.
I had my say and then my
I got kicked out, Dave.
You're back in?
Yeah, I went to breakout room 18 and then it just totally disconnected.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thanks for rejoining.
Well, my group was amazing. Just so you know, we're all on burnout, and reminding ourselves to take personal time is huge.
Awesome. Awesome.
We have 94 people back. I think we're good.
Well, I hope you found that time together really valuable in identifying those things that you are doing for yourselves, and maybe learning from other people kind of some of the things that help them take care of themselves. So I'm going to turn it over to Ada, who's going to review some of the resources that we have.
Okay, you seen the list of resources that we providing you about this presentation, along with the copy of the presentation itself. Everything is going to be for you available. We're going to have the trauma-informed approach for teaching through coronavirus, addressing race and trauma in the classroom, the SEL COVID-19 and race and equity resources, and the District Consulate Center, and the well-known Mission Control, SEL. We're going to have the trauma-informed practices resources in the Google Drive, and self-care resources, developing your self-care plan, and promoting teacher self-care. So everything is going to be available for you. You just have the best use of it. And just want to remind you that today has been a wonderful morning, because we were able to reach you, and as Michelle mentioned it earlier, we have a positive occurrence today. We have able to review an important and current topic, which is the trauma-informed practice and care, a topic that affects staff and the students. Now we'll be able to relate and have a closer understanding of trauma. We share the strategies to support our students in your classrooms, and of course, the awesome self-care and the resources that we're offering you right now. Hopefully you are prepared to start your fabulous new school year. Let's improve your life and your student lives, being mindful, and thank you for your attendance and your participation again.
Thank you, Ada. So I just would like to say on behalf of everyone, thank you to Annette, Lucero, Ada, and Michelle for this important information. I know it's a very difficult time, and I think this is an important topic for us all to remember, that we are all in this together, and we're here to support one another. And we are not alone. Though at times it may feel like it, you are not alone. So thank you very much for your time today. We'll go ahead and answer those questions on that Google Doc, and let's have a great start of the new year. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Dave. Have a great one.
Thank you. You too.